I'm sure, like the rest of you, I'm sitting here trying to chase ideas around my brain and trying to figure out which ones are the most useful to sort of focus on in terms of getting a conversation started, but also trying to draw some threads through what I thought were just an incredible set of presentations this morning. I hope you all share that view. I just, was really on the edge of my seat listening to what people had to say and reflecting on what it means, not just for CEDA, but also for Australia and our place in the world. Let me just start with a couple of observations. I had the great pleasure to be at this event last year, where, of course, Michael spoke about the Australian economy then. And let me just summarise what I think the big difference is from last year to this year. And it goes something like this. Last year, Michael kicked off with, right, grab the champagne bottles, we'll be popping corks this year, because the economy is looking fantastic. And I kind of finished today's presentation thinking, maybe a draft beer.
Beer.
Maybe a flat white, don't know. But I think we're in a very interesting time in terms of where the economy is going. We were talking about how really in the lead into Christmas everyone was feeling a bit more robust about it all, and now all of a sudden the wind seems to have come out of the sails. I was just across in WA earlier this week, and they're feeling a bit more positive about things on the back of commodity prices. So it's by no means a certain or consistent picture across the country. I think one of the things that we might want to talk about is just where we are with unemployment. And this, for economists, is just this great dilemma at the moment. Because, Michael, you said that for the Reserve Bank, the thing that's going to really matter is what happens with unemployment. Yet we're at an unemployment rate that in the past you'd think was pretty good, and if anything, you'd be worried about where inflation and wage pressure was going, but we just can't seem to nudge that at all, which of course is a really common theme in any of the observations that the Governor of the Central Bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia makes. So I just think that's maybe something we might flesh out a little bit more. And maybe people have got some interesting questions about that. It is, looking at the change in the unemployment rate is something anyone who watches interest rates always does. But, how much further and where is the elusive wages growth, I think is the question that everyone's asking. If I try to draw the threads between the rest of the conversations, it seems to me that one of the things that used to sort of permeate conversations a little bit more politically and policy-wise was a bit more of a win-win sense of things. And I was reminded about it when I looked through our report and the report talked in the China section that Jane Golly wrote about the Belts and Roads initiatives and how China is spruiking this as a win-win. And I thought, wow, that's almost like the first time I've seen this in the report, that anyone is talking about win-win. And if you take a step back and look at what's happening in domestic politics, the notion of win-win is just gone. It's all about who's the winner, who's the loser. How do we, what does this policy mean for this camp? What does this policy mean for that camp? And there seems to be a focus on everything around which we disagree or is polarising, and not any focus at all on where the consensus sits in the middle. And the same when you look through some of the comments, the same in the US. This is, Sarah's DMZ. It used to be that people thought, the growth in China and the assertion of China in Asia was actually a good thing, and we talked about win-win, and we talked about globalisation as win-win, whereas now it seems to be so much characterised as your gains are at my expense. And I wonder whether it's possible today to think about getting back to a place where we're actually talking about the mutuality of benefit in a way that seems less contested than any of the conversations that I think almost all of the other commentators spoke to. And then the final observation I wanted to make, two things actually. Peter Varghese spoke to, what's going to remain after Trump, and is he as unique as we think he is? Have a look at the chapter written by our German counterparts the first time they've contributed. Hubertus wrote a piece for us and reflect on what's going on in Europe. And he identifies the problems there, not just in terms of the governments of individual states and countries, but how this is reflecting through European governance, and how difficult it is now to get sensible policy coming out of the governance structures that we have relied on for so long. And I think sitting beneath this, for so long we've taken economic growth for granted as the glue that has bound mutuality and win-win together. And that was built on the institutions that Peter said we're now questioning more as to the certainty of the future, whether it's international institutions or some of our own institutions. So there's sort of how I'm trying to draw the threads, and maybe that will help prompt some questions in you. And the final thing that I wanted to do is to say, at the risk of being really gloomy, if you have a look through our report, the contribution from the Committee of Economic Development in the US highlights just where the US budget is going. In 10 years' time, the Congressional Budget Office projects that the US budget debt levels will be bigger than at any time since the conclusion of the Second World War, at which time defence spending was so huge that the idea that you could cut that, everyone agreed with. But that is astronomically important, because everyone knows that that and interest rates in the US are so important for the rest of the world. So put that alongside of the fact that by that stage, undoubtedly, on any measure, China is expected to be the biggest economy in the world, and in every developed country in the world, the baby boomers are retiring. That's a huge challenge. So I think the question for all of us, and I'm hoping what you want to engage in today, is what does that mean for organisations like CEDA? How do we start having the sharper conversations that pull the threads together on consensus rather than just difference? And how are we going to start getting some serious policy conversations around the sorts of things that we have to do to protect ourselves against this massive challenge in the future, which I think we need to start finding a way to have a better conversation around here, and to pick up what I think was Peter's final challenge is, what role Australia in all of this? And again, if you kick back and have a look at the role that Australia has played in previous moments of turbulence, particularly in being a bit of a go-between between Asia and South Asia in particular and the US, is that something that we can hope to do in the future? We've always been a big supporter behind the scenes of Indonesia, and I think we were talking at our table too about, you know, where Indonesia sits in all of that. That's my sort of grab bag of how we might start the conversation. As we go through, please feel free to reflect on anything as you want to the speakers here. As is always the case at CEDA events, if you have a question, please raise your hand. A microphone will come to you, and just let us know who you are and where you're from. And while we're doing that, I will do Kyle a favour and go straight to Peter and ask him about, you know, how you're seeing Indonesia's role in all of this, and does it stand aside in terms of facing the same sorts of problems that we're seeing of divisiveness and fake news and all the rest of it?
Okay, well, can I, before I get to Indonesia, just make a couple of observations about those diabolically difficult questions that you posed in your intro. You know, I think it's worth bearing in mind that the Australian experience of globalisation has been quite different to the American experience of globalisation, and I would argue also by and large to the non-Scandinavian European experience of globalisation. So in Australia, the fault lines between winners and losers overwhelmingly favoured winners, and where there were losers, I think our political system was probably a little bit more adept, not completely effective, but a little bit more adept at finding opportunities or solutions to help, whether it's industry restructuring programs or other government policies. So as a consequence, we have much less of a reaction to globalisation in our politics than you are now seeing in Europe and North America. And I think, you know, we should be pleased about that. On Indonesia, I mean, Australia still, I think, as a nation, doesn't think much about Indonesia, and at one level, that's extraordinarily surprising, given how close it is to us, how big it is, how large its economy is going to be over the next 15 or 20 years. I mean, Indonesia will probably be in the top 5 or so economies globally in not that many years, probably by, the mid-2030s or 40. So where Indonesia goes and how it thinks about Australia is going to become much, much more important to our interests. And I think what we're seeing in Indonesia is a palpable aspiration for economic growth and success, which Jokowi, as a political leader, is tapping into, and it's an economy which is likely to move not in a stellar fashion, but it'll probably go 5, 6, 7% growth a year, which by some standards may look stellar, but in terms of what Indonesia needs to do is probably still be underperforming. I think we need to do a lot more with the Indonesia relationship. I mean, I think Australian governments have been hammering away at this for quite some time, but the gap between that message and the engagement at the community level, including the business community, because our business links with Indonesia are woefully thin and very concentrated in just a few sectors. So as a business community, I think it's important that Australia starts thinking more about Indonesia and the opportunities of Indonesia. Because as we navigate this much more difficult global environment, it's absolutely key for Australia to start spreading its risks. And when you look around and think, what does spreading your risks mean from a trade and economic point of view, Indonesia, if you're thinking medium to long term, has to be very high on your list. In fact, I would argue India and Indonesia are the 2 big underdeveloped relationships that Australia needs to put a lot more effort in. And if we can succeed in spreading our risks from an economic point of view, we will be in a much, much stronger position. So I think Indonesia's got a huge number of challenges. I think the trajectory of political Islam in Indonesia is going to be a constant political challenge because you do have a community which has reasonably significant, but by no means anywhere near a majority pocket of very strong political Islamic thought, and you've got a political system which needs to try and accommodate that while staying in a broadly moderate path. And up to now, I think Indonesia's done pretty well on that, actually.
Next question over here.
Thank you. Janine Walker, Metro South Health and other places. My question is to, I suppose, to Michael and to Peter Van Onselen. And I want to return to the question of wage growth and the absence of wage growth in the economy and the comparison between the slow wages growth and the growth in profits and taxes. As we approach a federal election, the ACTU campaign Change the Rules will heat up, and certainly Greg Combet and the ACTU demonstrated with their rights campaign some time ago how effective that can be. And I'd like to take Peter Van Onselen to his observations about what sort of win, what sort of victory might Bill Shorten have, and how will that affect his capacity to respond on policy fronts. But certainly the Change the Rules campaign would say there is an explanation for slow wage growth, and it's because the rules aren't working.
Maybe just to launch into it, we spent all our time talking about monetary policy and fiscal policy. I've argued for a while now that we should also be including wages policy in there. And it's becoming a big issue. Now, we've heard the Governor of the Reserve Bank say a number of times that everybody should go back to work and ask for a pay rise because he sees the lack of wages growth as a significant issue. And well, I've tried it, didn't work, but doesn't stop anybody else from having a go. And to the point now where he's elevated it as a question of social cohesion. The fact that we're not kind of sharing the gains around, in a sense, is something that's damaging that sense of shared prosperity that he's talked about. So, the wages story should really be in focus. How do you get more wages growth going? Well, one line of argument is, well, you make sure you've got your economic policy settings exactly right. If you do that, then we keep generating jobs, we keep pushing down the unemployment rate, and that will eventually see some response on the wages front. And that is slowly happening. And I suppose the question is really, is it happening soon enough? What else can you do? Well, in a way, it's not just about wages, it's about what you've got left to spend after you pay taxes and the like. So certainly tax cuts would help. We've got some of those coming, and it appears the government's awash with cash at the moment, so I suspect we'll see some bigger tax cuts announced in the budget or during the election campaign. So we'll be doing something on that front. But of course, why can't we think outside the box in a sense? And one of the ideas they're debating in Japan, for example, is, well, we're going to cut company taxes, but we're only going to do it for those companies that they agree they're going to increase wages and their capital spending. So there's various sort of aspects of wages policy here we can debate, and we probably should be.
I think Michael's been a little bit unfair about there not being much by way of wages policies. I mean, Scott Morrison's going to create 1.25 million jobs in the next 5 years. So there you go. Lots of detail there. And Stuart Roberts says that they're all going to be full-time. So throw that in the mix as well. But I think that as far as Bill Shorten goes, to answer your question a little bit more seriously, in terms of how he wins, as I said, that will be important. I'm not comfortable with a prediction on that, to be frank. I can just as easily see the election narrowing and he wins but doesn't win well, as people at the last minute balking at the coalition and being too cynical by half given the moves afoot till now, and he wins Bob Hawke style. One thing I will say, though, is I think in government, Bill Shorten will be a very different Prime Minister to the style of opposition leader he is. I don't say this is an attack, but he is a political chameleon. You know, he knows how to fit himself to the moment, and he's adopted the Abbott approach in opposition to tear down Abbott first and then Turnbull and next Morrison. But I think that he will then adopt a quite different style in government. That will be interesting, though, because it will see him clashing with union leaders, for example. I think he will become an intermediary between the unions and business the same way he was, quite frankly, as a union leader, which at the moment he looks much more hostile towards business, but I think that's because he's playing a role in the lead up to the election. Now, his biggest challenge, I would argue, will be how to make that shift. Having embedded himself the way he is. Politicians used to be able to backflip much more easily. These days in the modern media with social media and all the rest of it, they get held much more to account when trying to do that. So his inclination will be to shift gears. I think that the public will give him the benefit of the doubt. His unpopularity fades as a relevancy factor once he becomes Prime Minister. Even Tony Abbott became popular for 5 minutes when he became PM. So Australians give you the benefit of the doubt, but then it will be a challenge for him to replicate that intermediary role he plays between workers and bosses as a union leader, as Prime Minister. It will be tougher, but I think that will be his inclination, because Bill Shorten, I'll just say this in a broad sense to end, he doesn't just want to be Prime Minister. I mean, he certainly wants to be Prime Minister, but he wants to be the first Prime Minister since Howard not to be a joke of a Prime Minister. And interestingly, possibly taken on by Abbott, he starts with people assuming he will be a joke in some respects, but I think he's very cognizant of wanting to be, the first Prime Minister, if you like, since Howard to actually win a re-election or even contest a re-election. So he's not just trying to get into office, and that's why he's tolerating all of these big policy scripts. That's why he's prepared to not ultimately fully cave on the asylum seeker issue. He doesn't want to just win. He wants to win and then be able to govern based on how he won. And there is one challenge in that mix, of course, which is that he's hostile between unions and business. That's the one area where he has, if you like, been prepared to really carve out that role as an opposition leader, where he will have to shift.
Question over here.
Yes, Leo Hammett from ACOM. This is probably a question for Simon, but for the broader response also. The mutuality of benefit that was spoken of, I think, is less achievable in the context of uncertainty that's characterised much of the discussion this morning, which of course speaks to the complexity. In a historical basis, we used to then place a reliance on august institutions such as the UN and NATO and all of that, and we're seeing a dilution of their influence across in a global and other context. I was just wishing to see in how that might play out in a geopolitical and other context, and whether that's, how relevant is that to today's discussion?
Thank you. It's absolutely relevant. I was running long, so I didn't mention this in my remarks, but I'll do so now. The thing about America First under Trump is that America has gone a little MIA in key international fora.
Sorry, did you say a little?
In particular, and then not just the established sort of the Bretton Woods institutions where America is typically led, the one we should perhaps be the most concerned about is the WTO. And there are some appointments coming up there that Trump may or may not make, and in not making them or delaying them really starts to gut that organisation. The flip side of that is that Trump says, well, who cares? That organisation is garbage anyway, and America First means America is big enough and bad enough to go toe-to-toe with China on trade or whatever. Now, when both sides of Australian politics say we believe in the rules-based international order, right, what we mean by that is what? Well, we're the number 17 economy in the world or whatever we are. It's really, really good for the world's number 17 economy when the world's number 1, 2, and 3 economy bind their hands voluntarily and contest each other in these institutions that the United States helped build after World War II. And so one of the risks, and we were just talking about this at our table briefly before we came up, what does 8 years of Trump look like for those international institutions of continued neglect from the American administration? What does that mean for a country like Australia, who hasn't got the throw weight necessarily that the world's number 1, 2, and 3 economies do? What does the world look like for the world's number 17 economy, where those institutions, their relevance starts to unravel? And I think that's one of the big things about what's going on with China at the moment, that Trump not throw the strategic baby out with the tariff bathwater. The deal he settles for doesn't lose sight of the bigger game here. And Peter alluded to this, that we want China to come into the international system playing by, quote unquote, the rules that countries have been adhering to more or less, or at least in the fora for figuring it out since World War II. And for me, that's one of the big crisis points that we're looking at internationally at the moment, with tremendous stakes for, again, to come back to it, for an economy, for a country the size of Australia, the damage being done to those institutions that have served us well for the most part for decades and decades.
I mean, those institutions have served Australia tremendously well, not just in protecting our interests, but also enabling Australia to have a greater voice than it would otherwise have. And you mentioned the WTO. Of course, the US is the country that determines who leads the World Bank. And at a time when you're looking at the discussion about divisions between developing and developed countries and the need to instill growth and solid institutions within the developing world, the World Bank is fundamental, and it's often overlooked, and it's going to be absolutely critical. We've got a question here.
Pretty Phillip from Deloitte Access Economics. Two quick questions. One to Michael and Peter in relation to the earlier question on wages. Do you think there's something left in the corporatist model that we might think about going forward as a way of governing, particularly around wages? But secondly, Australia's relationship with China over the last decade has probably been viewed through a prism rather simplistically of for the US alliance or against it. Given that, I think, Peter, your words were what lies ahead is more complicated at best, what do you see as some of the principles for us thinking about our relationship with China in the years ahead beyond just the simplistic US alliance for and against?
Well, I suppose on the wages front, what's worthwhile thinking about here, the flip side of weak wages growth is that real labour costs in Australia have gone nowhere for the last 6 years. That's been fantastic in terms of supporting that 1.25 million jobs a year, or over 3 years, whatever the figure is that is the current government's target. So you've got to kind of look at these things in totality rather than in isolation, I think. But while the wages story, the household income story is very weak at the moment, the fact is national income is actually growing quite strongly. And that's courtesy of the turnaround in commodity prices we've seen. So we've seen that flow into company profits. From there, we've seen it flow into government revenues. It's why the budget deficit is disappearing. What's kind of missing is the link into the household part of the story, because we're not seeing it happen in wages. And of course, if you think about the history of the commodity cycle in Australia, one of the ways we share the gains around is through tax cuts. And they do look like they're coming, or at least bigger ones that are already sitting there are coming. So in a way, I think that's just the right policy response. If, as I talked about today, all the risks are in the household side and weak income growth, weak spending power is part of the story, then finding a way of lifting spending power is an important objective for policy.
And just very quickly to build on that, if Bill Shorten finds himself in his Labor government, find himself in the wrong part of the electoral cycle vis-a-vis the economic cycle, that will, have a profound impact on how they go about implementing some of the reforms that they've already announced. Equally, if I'm wrong and he shifts and changes stylistically as a Prime Minister to be more conciliatory between unions and business, if I could put it that way, if I'm incorrect about that, then I think that there's a real risk that regulation, more overt regulation, creeps into the wages policy space under a Labor government, and I don't think business would welcome that.
I'm just going to jump in and ask Sarah a quick question. One of the issues, and maybe this is sort of looking at things from the Australian perspective, but all these debates, do get dumbed down. I was really, and I'm going to talk about immigration.
Uh-huh.
So the whole US immigration debate at the moment seems to be cast as the wall or not the wall. But there was some really interesting research that came out, I think, from Cato, that did identify some of the challenges of a really strong influx of low-skilled illegal migrants in particular. And the fact that this is sort of playing into Trump's base in the sense that it erodes wages for low-skilled workers and people who are struggling to get into the labour market, but actually benefits high-income workers because they get cheap services effectively. Does the tone of any of that debate and the fact that this is a serious social and economic issue that does deserve to be fleshed out beyond just should we build a flippin' big wall, does that play out at all?
Yeah, I think it does, and I think it is an important conversation to have. I think if you drill down and you talk to people in Washington or indeed any part of the country and you ask, should there be some sort of immigration reform across the board, you're going to hear people say, yes, we need to take a look at this, we need to figure this out. I would also say that there's a certain degree of hypocrisy. So, for example, in parts of the country with a lot of illegal or undocumented immigrant populations, you have a large pool of labor that's available for non-minimum wage or lower rates. I mean, I certainly saw it when I lived in New York City. Things have tightened up a bit, but that's a part of it. So there's this kind of, you want to have it both ways. One other piece to add to this is that there's, I was talking to the man who's the head of the Virginia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C., that portion of that, and he was saying that it's important to remember that of Fortune 500 companies, 40% of Fortune 500 companies in the United States were started by first-generation immigrants, their children, or grandchildren. So, the United States really has a complicated set of understandings with this. And I'm going to throw one more number into this for the crowd. Joseph Stiglitz, who was in Sydney recently, he's the one who came up with the term the 1%, Columbia University professor. He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, so he's way smarter at numbers than I am. But one of the points that he made recently in an interview was that when the government shutdown happened, the reason that was so painful across the board was that so many many Americans have so little cash on hand, and I dare say that's a problem here too. People might have retirement accounts, they have their cars, they have their house, they've got a lot of money in their house, but how much money do they have if you just turn off the pump and they lose their job? And what he said was that a quarter of Americans, their cash on hand is $400, and 2/3, it's between $1,000 and $1,200. So those numbers blew my mind. And the significance of that with immigration is you can see the tension. If you're worried about your job and supporting your family and you're worried your job could go away, then that sense of other people coming in and taking your jobs, it's hard to sit down and have a calm conversation about exactly what that means and what that looks like. And there's opportunities for posturing on both sides and not really having a concrete conversation about what that means and how a nation that has historically been, a nation of immigration, land of the Statue of Liberty, etc., how America deals with this today.
I think we've got a question in the middle here.
Thanks, Melinda Ann Tiernan from Griffith University. I want to bring it back to home, if we can, for a minute, because there's something we haven't talked about but actually cuts across something that each of the speakers has discussed today, and it's really about the New South Wales election and what an election in that state, with what we're seeing in terms of the pressures on house prices, Michael, in terms of some of the dynamics that might happen there, the state-to-state relationships, Simon, that you were talking about. Can I just invite the panel to reflect on the New South Wales election and what that might mean and what implications that might have in the year ahead?
Just put State of the Origin right back out there. Anyone?
Can I start?
Yep.
Well, the first point to make, I think, is what must be the profound frustration of the Premier at having to go to the polls before Scott Morrison. That reflected in a tweet by one of her members of Parliament who implored the feds to get on with losing so that a good government can win. So I think that dynamic is interesting because we normally know that voters are smarter than that. They decide between state and federal tiers, but I do think that there has been a lot more risk this time of overlap. And it's interesting because the New South Wales Liberal government are very different in their policy complexion to the feds. I mean, just starting with energy policy to begin. But there are so many overlaps where the signs of the problems of the broken compact between the Commonwealth and the state are on display on everything from immigration policy to congestion and infrastructure. So I don't have a clear answer on what will happen or what the guides are of that in terms of the way that the vote might turn out. But I do think that the issues in New South Wales which are dominating the election are those core issues which overlap with the feds but won't be the core issues at the federal level, I think, when we get to that campaign.
Well, and I suppose I can add to that. It's another interesting example here of how you can be presiding over a strong economy and not necessarily get any of the sort of political gains out of that, I suppose. I mean, the unemployment rate in New South Wales, I think, is in the low 4s, so we're well below that 5% full employment level. So, from that pure economic perspective, things look pretty good. I mean, the government is actually doing the things the voters wanted to do in terms of building infrastructure and so on. But that's turning out to be a negative as well because everybody's fed up with the fact that George Street's been dug up to build a tram line for the last few years. So it's interesting how these sort of things that you would tend to think of as positives can actually play out in a negative way. And you can see this coming through in some of the opinion polls and so on, where they ask voters, what's important to you? And what stands out in those surveys is the importance of things like the economy and unemployment have gone way down. So those kind of traditional economic strengths of Liberal governments, coalition governments, if you like, are less important. What's gone up on the other side? Well, it's health on the one hand, and security, personal security on the other. So you've got the recipe here for another Mediscare campaign on the one hand and another law and order election on the other. It seems to me. But yes, it just shows how kind of sort of volatile the electorate is at the moment in terms of what's important, and the politics, the outcomes will follow that, I suppose.
It's really interesting. I'm going to put a CEDA plug in here because anyone who wants to understand what the community is looking for can have a look at our community pulse work that we did last year, which we looked at a national level and also a state level, and it does, confirm exactly what Michael was saying, that issues that people are looking to see politicians address are these long-term issues that concern them about their well-being. So healthcare, aged care, and indeed personal security, although as those of us from Melbourne will recall how that played out in the state election there. We've got time for one more question, if anyone wants to shoot a hand up. Aha, thank you, just here. Otherwise, I, of course, was going to jump in, so...
Thank you. My name's Kath Gelber. I'm from the University of Queensland. This is for both Simon and Peter. Peter, you were talking about winning like hawk, and I'm wondering if either of you has a reflection on the persistent and growing non-major party votes, and that's manifesting more in the lower house. We've seen it for decades in the upper house, but we're now seeing more of it, I think, in the upper house, and a growing experience of that in the lower house, and what that might mean for stability in government moving forward.
I'll go first. I've got very strong views on that. I think it's really interesting to see the growth of minor party independence in the lower house in the wake of what was such a scare campaign against them during the Gillard years. So they've fought back very quickly from that. But I think what drives it is a profound frustration in the electorate with the cardboard cutout politicians on both sides. Once upon a time, I'll try to be as quick as I can on this, but once upon a time, your typical Liberal politician came from a diverse background, professions, professionals of some sort, business, small and large. These days, they have that on their CV, but if you dig a little bit deeper, they didn't really do much when they were there. They used it as an entree into politics, and they're a career politician or a career hack. Somewhere in that fit. And so you don't have that diversity. It's not much better on the Labor side. The union movement's not as broad as it once was, so therefore the fact that people are coming from the union movement is more narrow casting that sort of more traditional working class background than it once was. So voters are fed up with it. And then when you throw in that over the top layer that Australian politics, more than most other countries, is incredibly disciplined in voting patterns and the inability of local MPs to properly represent their area, that element comes out as well. And all of that is before we even then get to the disaffected voter that comes from an ideological perspective, that breaks away from this tribalism of supporting a party just for the sake of it. Issues are, people are so issue-based now, and so they don't want to necessarily wed themselves to one side or the other. So then you've got that on top of it as well. So all of these things come together and just make major party candidates look profoundly unattractive. And so voters are voting with their feet and going for local notables or whatever it might be.
Two things to add to that, wearing my poli-sci professor hat for a moment. Australia's unique in many ways, but one of the ways in which we're a little special in the democratic world, perhaps not unique, but special, is with compulsory voting. It means that you are forced to buy the product on sale as a voter. You can't opt out of the marketplace right? And so that means the political entrepreneur who's saying, I'm none of the above, and indeed we once had a political party whose whole raison d'etre was keeping the bastards honest. Right? What does that mean? It just means we're not them. Right? And so there is compulsory voting means there's a ready-made constituency for that at the polls in Australia, number one. Number two, the method of election to the Australian Senate makes it quite, particularly in a double D, lowers the cost of entry, as it were, for those sorts of political entrepreneurs with that sort of none of the above message. And the final observation there, this is empirical, if you take the AEC, God love the AEC, they go to compared to doing this analysis in the United States, you go to the AEC website, they geocode every polling place. And it's a fun little afternoon of computing, but you can compute distance of each polling place from the GPO in each state, and you can compute in the Senate voting of that polling place how many voted for a non-conventional candidate. That plot of voting for neither Labor, Lib, Nat, or Green, even called Green a mainstream party these days, as a function of distance from the GPO, it just takes off once, and it's symbiotic of this sort of cosmopolitan versus the real ethos of the country residing out. Once we get a 3-hour drive away from Brisbane, that's where real people are. It maps onto that very neatly, that these real salt of the earth, of the soil candidates aren't to be found in major metros. That's where you get the suit-wearing hack and the guy and girl that's been to uni and whatnot. And you throw all that together, add on compulsory voting and a low threshold for entry, and you get this really interesting phenomenon in Australia where it has this very, very strong geographic pattern to it.
And Simon, add compulsory preferencing at the federal level as well, and that's why someone like Tony Abbott's in such trouble, because 51% primary, even if that dips to 45% primary in any other electorate, that gets you over the line in a first past the post system or whatever. But if you're voting against somebody rather than for them under compulsory voting and preferential voting that's compulsory as well, he's in trouble, because there's potentially more than 50% of people comfortably in his own electorate that would vote against him, even if his primary vote's always going to be over 40.
Now, just while Kyle's coming up here, I haven't told her I'm going to do this, but I'm going to have a bit of fun. Now I get to ask you guys a question. One of the things that we were debating at the top of our table was, is Trump going to be re-elected? Now, I'm going to ask you this question, holding you, I'm an economist, holding you to the standards of economists on their forecast, rather than political commentators who all have to come up and say, mea culpa, I got it wrong. Economists never need to say that. So, show of hands, who think Trump's re-elected at the next election?
Ooh.
All right, we'll be back in a couple of years. Kyle.
So, but what was that as a proportion? We need to...
let's say he won't.
What do you think it was?
I don't know.
Okay, hands up again. Who thinks he's winning?
Okay, now
Well, it's
who
gone
thinks
down
he's
a little.
losing?
Who thinks he's losing?
And who thinks he doesn't get to the election because he gets fired?
Well, who thinks he's not running?
Ha!
So I think more people think he's losing.
Yeah, but not by... It's not overwhelming. It was
okay.
like 60-40.
Thanks, that's a bit of fun.